Welcome to my TED Talk. My name is Max Perler. This is the REHUGO project, which I completed in my AP English language class. In this presentation, I will share my research question, then explain my purpose and process, and answer the research question. Finally, I'm going to lead you through the research to defend my conclusion. How has the platform and ethos of the Republican Party in the United States changed over time? Besides my interest in political science, politics affects all our lives. The goals and policies of our government can profoundly impact our liberties. It's important to pay attention to what our political leaders are saying and doing. My research process was straightforward. I organized my information chronologically, mixing information from different sources to show change over time. One source in particular contained a substantial amount of information spanning the founding of the Republican Party to today. An episode of the podcast Road to Now, hosted in part by Dr. Benjamin Sawyer, a historian. This particular episode interviewed acclaimed historian and experienced college professor Heather Cox Richardson. She has written and taught extensively on the Republican Party. I decided to use this podcast interview as the basis of my presentation and include the specific information from my other sources to enrich it, making a detailed answer to the question. The Republican Party's platform and ethos have gone from those which concern themselves with truth, legality, the Constitution, and helping the little guy, to a party solely concerned with often false rhetoric, conservatives' personal agenda, and serving wealthy Christians. According to Richardson in the RTN podcast, the Republican Party has its roots in the year 1854, when a group of former Whigs, Free Soil members, and others positioned against slavery came together. This new Republican Party established itself as the party of the little guy, fighting to stop the expansion of slavery. They were not all morally opposed to slavery. Lincoln wasn't, at least not openly. Instead, Lincoln used a legal and constitutional basis to argue that slavery should not expand west. And even when he put a stop to slavery in the South, it was on a legal basis. Landowners in rebelling states could not legally own slaves after the Emancipation Proclamation. Slave states that remained with the Union were immune from this. This established the party as one based on legality in the Constitution, on factual arguments, even when moral ones are tempting. After the Civil War, the Republican Party began to undergo changes that impacted their platform. There are changes in both the North and the South. One of my history sources, an online article from students of history titled The Great Switch, How the Republican and Democratic Parties Flipped Ideologies, combined with Richardson's expert testimony on the road to now, paints a picture of political changes in the North. Post-war industry had made businessmen in the North very wealthy, and as most of them were Republican, the party began to prioritize business interests, such as laissez-faire policies. This was an economic shift. There was also a racial one. After their devastating loss in the war, Southern Democrats tried to save face by claiming they fought the war solely to prevent white tax dollars from going to African Americans. While this is blatantly false, Republicans still defended themselves by shying away from the interests of black people in the North. Overall, this combination of change in the economic and racial priorities of the Republican Party began transforming them into the party of wealthy white businessmen, which they are still known for today. However, the black vote would not be totally lost, nor the white vote totally gained, until the Civil Rights era. In the South, as my other podcast, The Roots of the Party's Racial Switch, produced by the Science of Politics, notes, Republicans realized they would need to appeal to white voters in order to have a political presence there. This caused some internal fracturing, but ultimately, groups called lily white groups of Republicans ended up with power. This alienated black voters, who were already starting to migrate to the North to escape white supremacy, where they were courted by Democrats. White conservative Democrats, who were mainly in the South, started moving to the Republican Party. But again, as political science professor Kenesha Grant points out in the podcast, these changes were slow. It's important to note that race wasn't the only national issue after the Civil War. One of my sources for history, the Republican Party platform of 1880, details from the horse's mouth the party's positions on some of the other things happening at the time. They were in favor of supporting public education, religious neutrality, reducing the debt, and humane immigration limits. These stances are the opposite of what the party supports today. Think charter schools, Ten Commandments legislation, mass deportation, the big beautiful bill. And this constitutes significant platform changes. Richardson details that by the 1920s, Republicans were solidly pro-business, and the ideal of helping the little guy had faded. However, when the Great Depression hit, Republicans looked foolish for their laissez-faire, non-interventionist policies. However, a number of Republicans actually hardened their stance, becoming firmly against government intervention in the name of personal liberties. The Students of History article corroborates these events, noting how the Democrats' expansion of governmental ability was seen by Republicans as hurting the country. This stance was unpopular at the time and was one of the factors in a period of Democratic strength. After FDR replaced Hoover in 1933, there wouldn't be another Republican president for 20 years. During the Civil Rights era, small government sentiment began to gain steam. Richardson points out that it was invoked to combat civil rights legislation, and ironically, Republicans made the argument that these acts would give white people's tax dollars to the black population. This is false, just like it was when the Democrats made the accusation after the Civil War. We've already seen how the Republican Party abandoned its ethos of representing the little guy Now we're seeing how they began to abandon the logical legal arguments based on truth in the Constitution that the party was founded on. During this time, black people completed a long building shift to the Democratic Party because of conservatives' position on civil rights. As we move into the late 1900s, let's assess where we are. The Republican Party now serves business interests. Increasing liberalism in the Democratic Party has pushed Southern whites to replace African Americans in this Republican Party. They and the party are non-interventionists and are becoming associated with an intense movement conservatism that manifested as a backlash against the aforementioned mid-1900s liberalism, according to Richardson. They are also fervently against civil rights. In one sentence, the Republicans are the Democrats of the Civil War era. However, these changes are about to be amplified. Let's transition to the late 1900s with Ronald Reagan and his 1980 inaugural address. In this speech, which I watched from my second entertainment source, he stressed that the government needed to be limited in order to preserve personal liberty. He also discussed the importance of states' rights. His remarks during this address foreshadowed his policies of deregulation, supply-side economics, state sovereignty, and free enterprise that truly formed the transition to modern republicanism. Richardson points out, however, that the business-centric ideas behind supply-side economics have been discredited many times for multiple reasons. This constitutes another significant perversion of truth for the Republican Party. Called it by the 1980s, the Republican voting base was mostly white Southerners, and that conservatives fought civil rights legislation by making false claims alleging racial tax redistribution. However, in the 1980s, wealth distribution was actually starting to skew heavily towards the top earners. Richardson mentions this, but you can also simply research income inequality statistics like the Gini index or distribution percentages for more proof. Again, we're seeing the Republican Party depart from reality in a way that would have been unthinkable a century before. A massive change occurred in the Republican Party through the 80s, expertly outlined in the documentary Bad Faith, which I used as my other entertainment source. The idea that God intended this country to be for white Christians has been around since at least the end of Reconstruction, but its influence shaped a new religious right in the 1980s. Factors that played into and influenced the changes are numerous, but I'll give a brief summary. In 1979, a Republican political strategist named Paul Weyrich started the Moral Majority, a religious group with the goal of mobilizing Christians who were angry with the liberal turn society had taken into a voting bloc for the Republican Party. By utilizing a vast network of preachers, communication, and a newfound partnership with large oil companies, the Moral Majority was the catalyst for a significant evangelical Republican bloc set on molding the country to its exclusionist will, even, as a manifesto by Weyrich stated, by insurrection. Essentially, many white Christians began to see themselves as God's chosen people and victims of current trends. Overall, opposition to equal rights movements and interventionist legislation created a new Republican Party in the late 1900s defined by passionate movement conservatism. Think tanks like the Heritage Foundation, started by Paul Weyrich himself, youth movements like Young America's Foundation, and religious movements like the Moral Majority sprang out of this discontent. These groups exemplified the new values that Republicans stood by, the interest of wealthy white Christians, even at the expense of facts and the less fortunate. What a change. Today, facts continue to be circumvented in the Republican Party. My two sources for reading, the 2024 official party platform, as well as the Project 2025 mandate for leadership, which many conservative political figures contributed to, contain many fallacies. Both contain baseless anti-immigrant rhetoric, despite immigrants having a crime rate lower than that of American citizens and a proven immense contribution to the economy, performing jobs many Americans don't want. The word woke appears 33 times, and the word radical appears 49 times in Project 2025. These empty, unproductive buzzwords prove an inability to discuss issues with maturity, and the implications show a blatant hate for any personal identities such as the LGBTQ community outside their restrictive, often religiously motivated conservative norm. And despite data showing it's not feasible, the 2024 platform displays an obsession with bringing manufacturing back to America. The nation has been significantly deindustrialized since at least the 1980s, and the cheap labor and goods of overseas production have benefited our economy. If the facts were analyzed, it would be clear to Republicans that this is not a worthwhile endeavor. The Republican Party continues to prioritize the interests of wealthy Americans. Tax cuts and deregulation define the ethos of the party. Racist rhetoric has cooled somewhat towards African Americans, but is now directed at immigrants with just as little cause. Let's look back on the first Republicans. They wished to fight for the little guy, for the most vulnerable among us. Led by Lincoln, they prioritized the law and the Constitution and relied on truth over rhetoric. That's the standard, then today's Republican Party has unequivocally lost legitimacy. Their policies and philosophies are not based on facts, but serve to advance a conservative agenda, an agenda which today not only opposes tolerance of different groups of people, but that contains no common sense.